ready to go? I can open us in prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you for the time for us to be together and to study your word. I pray that this will be edifying and used for your glory. So in his name I pray, amen. Okay, so we are back in Samuel 1. We're going through the early monarchy. We are still making our way through the story of Saul. Back in 13, we have Saul offering the sacrifice when he wasn't supposed to. Then we have the story of Jonathan attacking the Philistines. In 16, we have David being anointed. And today, we're going to be in 1 Samuel 17, which is arguably one of the most famous stories in the Bible. It's a story that everyone knows. It's a chapter that I haven't been looking forward to, mainly because it's such a famous story and everyone knows it. It's hard to know what to say that hasn't already been said. I tend to like parts of the Bible that either we tend to overlook or ignore. I also like parts of the Bible that we tend to know a little too well and probably don't know as well as we should. But David and Goliath is just one of those stories that, again, it's so well trod, it's hard to think of anything new to say. But it's next, so we're going to go through it whether we like it or not. I'm joking. I assume most of you like this story. So it begins in verse 1. The Philistines gathered their forces for war at Soko in Judah and camped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes-Dammim. Saul and the men of Israel gathered and camped in the valley of Elah. There they lined up in battle formation to face the Philistines. The Philistines were standing on one hill, and the Israelites were standing on another hill with a ravine between them. So here's our trusty little map of roughly the lower half of Israel. The yellow is Jerusalem. We should know roughly where that is. And Soko is the red dot. It is almost directly south of Beth Shemesh, which we've seen referenced earlier. And it is roughly due west of Bethlehem, not too far from the Philistine territory. I have been to the valley of Elah, and it is just a big valley, just a big open valley. There are hills all around it, which makes it almost ideal for a battle. This is something that anyone who's gone there or people have looked at it, archaeologists, geologists, even war historians, they all agree. It's just a perfect place for battle because you've got all these hills, so you can kind of line up your men on the hills, you can defend them, or you can just meet in the middle to fight in the open. It's just ideal. So when it says that there was a battle there are probably many battles in the Valley of Elah because it's just so ideal for this purpose. So here we have a better map, and we have a reference to Azekah, some sort of city. You can see that to the north. The Philistines are camped on Soko, and there's this ridge to the south, whereas the Israelites are camped on the northern ridge. So both armies are just camped out on the ridges, and in between is this big, deep valley, right? This big open plain. So the two armies can meet in the valley and have their battle. Again, it's just perfectly ideal for this sort of thing. So verse 4. Then a champion named Goliath from Gath came up from the Philistine camp. He was 9 feet, 9 inches tall. In the Hebrew, he's called a man between, which is a really odd phrase, and it's only used here and nowhere else because it's a very unique phrase. There's some debate over exactly what it means, but within the context, we know that he is clearly unique from all the other figures, from all the other warriors. He stands out. He is the pinnacle of the pinnacles, right? He is the overall best. So the champion, it's probably not a bad way to translate. That's how most Bible translations go with it. But he is clearly unique among all their forces. Then we get to the fun question of exactly how tall was he. The Hebrew refers to him as 6.5 cubits. What's a cubit? All right, from the famous joke. A cubit is roughly 18 inches, although you get into when you have the issue of measurements based on hands and forearms and feet, you get into the question of at what point was this standardized? So when was the 18 inches standardized? There's the argument, of course, that they're using the forearm and that was used, it was measured according to the king. So if you have a tall king, then it might be longer than 18 inches. If you have a short king, it might be shorter than 18 inches. I have no idea where that comes from. I have no idea when it was standardized. So was it exactly 18 inches? I don't know. So I'm not questioning 6.5 cubits. I just don't know when 18 inches was the official number. But that would make it roughly 117 inches, which makes him about 9 feet 3/4, somewhere around there. We'll just say 9.5 to 10 feet. That's very, very, very tall. The Greek, however, has 4.5 cubits, which makes him about 81 inches. That puts him about 6 feet and 3/4. That's a much more believable height. I know because my brother is that tall. So I'm not questioning the Hebrew. It's possible. So if we're going with 6 to 7 feet tall, there are plenty of people that tall. There are athletes that tall. We have athletes who are 7 feet tall. This is an actor. He was on Game of Thrones. He is almost 7 feet tall. He's a very burly guy. He plays burly fighters, right? He was in Game of Thrones. He's been in a few other things. His name is Bronson. And for reference, that is his wife. She is barely 5 feet. So you can see just how tall he is. And if David is short, you might have a height discrepancy of about this different distance. The tallest recorded man in recent memory is famously Robert Wadlow. He was almost 9 feet tall. So historically, there is some precedence for this, and it's possible that people in the ancient world, that there could have been someone that tall. We just don't have a whole lot of references to it. So again, it's not completely outside the realm of possibility that someone could be roughly that tall, but it is very, very tall. So in verse 5, he wore a bronze helmet and bronze scale armor that weighed 125 pounds. There was bronze armor on his shins. So we're in the early-ish Iron Age, but bronze is still used. Bronze is still preferred for a number of reasons. It's more malleable, it's more durable. They haven't completely shifted over to iron for all their utensils. So that he's wearing bronze is not necessarily anachronistic or inappropriate. He wears a bronze helmet. This is in contrast to a lot of soldiers, especially the Israelites, who are wearing whatever they've got. So he clearly has a full set of armor. He's got a nice, thick bronze helmet, and he's got, it mentions scale armor. Again, this seems fairly realistic and true to the times, what he probably would have worn. Weighs 125 pounds, which seems like a lot, but he's a big guy, and he's strong, so he's got thick armor. In verse 6, it mentions that he has a bronze sword slung between his shoulders. Again, this isn't necessarily anachronistic, a bronze weapon. Some translations will say a javelin, but sword is more accurate. Now, when you think sword, you're probably thinking a straight sword. This is kind of what's depicted here. However, in the Hebrew, it actually refers to it as a curved sword. Now, some translations will say scimitar. This is anachronistic, because scimitars are a very specific kind of sword. When it says a curved sword, it's probably more like what's in this picture. So we've got a couple of swords for reference. On the far right, you have a sort of a gladius, kind of a more Western straight sword, short sword, kind of what the Romans would use. Then one over is sort of a curved Greek-style sword. And then the one in the middle is an Egyptian kophesh. It's that's kind of what he's using here in this picture. And then if you go over to the next two, these are Mesopotamian sickle swords. These were very, very common. This is what Assyrians used. This is what Mesopotamians used. This is what the Akkadians used. When it says that, when it mentions Abraham, that he went out and fought against the 5 kings and he carried swords, they're probably describing something like this. Sickle swords. So they're curved. They're kind of like primitive scimitars, although scimitars are later and they have very distinct shapes and uses. But this is probably something like the one on the far left. So it's probably what he's carrying, as opposed to what you might be thinking, either a somewhat standard Western straight sword, maybe something like what the Romans would use. Again, that's kind of anachronistic. Or just a straight-up Arabian scimitar. Again, that's kind of anachronistic. In verse 7, his spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, and the iron point of his spear weighed 15 pounds. So he has a big, thick spear. This also is probably fairly accurate. Warriors back then usually didn't fight with swords. They fought with spears, primarily. They had a spear, Because spears are very efficient weapons, they're very deadly weapons. I've heard him argue that they are the true king of weapons. They're easy to use. You can have a shield in one hand, a spear in the right hand, and it gives you range, gives you distance, and it's very easy to poke your opponent with a spear. Whereas swords require a lot of skill, they require a lot of training, and swords are expensive, right? Because swords are just one big piece of metal, whereas a spear is much cheaper, right? You can get just a long shaft and put your point at the top, and if the spear breaks, you can always get another shaft. The sword breaks, you're kind of out of luck. So the idea that he's fighting with sword and shield is probably very accurate. That's more likely how they were fighting back then. We do have this interesting reference to the iron point, because again, we're in the early Iron Age. So he is using iron weapons, although iron's going to be expensive, and it's not going to be as durable compared to bronze. So he's using it for his spear, but that would make the spear tip very strong, very deadly. So moving on, in verse 7, in addition, a shield bearer was walking in front of him. This is, again, probably fairly accurate. He is standing out, but he's got a person holding the shield in front of him. This allows him freedom to have his spear. Maybe he throws the spear or whatever, but he can stand behind the shield person to protect him from attacks and so on. And the idea of having an armor bearer or a shield bearer or someone to carry your weapons with you is fairly well documented in all kinds of ancient texts. We see this in stories like the Iliad, where the great champions would have someone behind them kind of caddying their weapons for them because they don't want to carry all the weapons themselves. Jonathan has an armor bearer, and Saul has an armor bearer, and so on. So the idea that he, as this great champion, has someone kind of carrying his extra weapons for him is probably not inaccurate. Verse 8. He stood and shouted to the Israelite battle formations. "Why do you come out to line up in battle formation?" he asked them. "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose one of your men and have him come out down against me. If he wins in a fight against me and kills me, we will be your servants. But if I win against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us." There's a lot of interesting things about chapter 17. For one, it's one of the lengthier battle scenes in the Old Testament. It's also one of the most detailed battle scenes. It really stands out in contrast to most of the others, especially in Samuel and Kings. We also have a lot of dialogue, more than we usually get, back and forth. We get a lot of Saul's dialogue, we get David's dialogue, we get Goliath's dialogue, just very detailed. Again, it stands out as a very particular and special narrative. Here, of course, we have this great champion of Goliath, and he is going to call out a champion of the Israelites. So we have a depiction of champion combat, and this brings up a whole new can of worms. How common was champion combat? Do we have any references to it? We do. So some commentaries will say that it's complete, some will agree that's just completely made up, that we don't have any records of it, that there's no clear indication, but there are some references. So in the tale of Sinewy, you have a reference to the main character who is called out by one of the enemy champions, and they fight, although the stakes aren't quite as high as the battle here in chapter 17. There's also a reference in the Apology of Hattusili III, where he goes and he's going against the enemy, and he's more or less alone, and he ends up calling out one of the champions of the opposing army, and they do a duel, and he ends up winning and defeating the enemy that way. So the idea of champion combat is not completely unattested otherwise. But far and away, the most famous example of champion combat is going to be between Hector and Achilles, right, in the Iliad. Now, the Iliad is going to be a later story, right? It's going to happen a little bit later during the Bronze Age collapse, so a couple hundred years from where we are. But we do have some acknowledgement of this within ancient records. So in verse 8, then the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel today. Send me a man so we can fight each other." When Saul and all Israel heard these words from the Philistines, they lost their courage and were terrified. So this raises a question that seems very common, and it's surprising that this question is raised and not a different question. The initial question is, why doesn't Saul go out to fight? Isn't Saul the champion of Israel? Not necessarily, right? He's the king, sure, but he's been king for a while now. it's very likely that he's getting on in years, that he's aging. He may not be the champion of Israel anymore. Certainly not the champion he was when he was younger, when he was 20, 30, 40 years old. It seems like the champion would be Jonathan. He's the crown prince. He's the one who led that daring rescue against the Philistines a few chapters earlier. My question is, I'm surprised I didn't see a single commentary ask it, where's Jonathan? Why doesn't he take up the challenge? Why doesn't he represent Saul? He'd have the right to. In fact, it seems like all eyes would be pointing to him, not Saul. Saul's an old king. What's he going to do? Jonathan is the crown prince. He's the future. He's the one, that Israel's future is resting on. Presumably, when Saul dies, Jonathan is next in line. He's already proven himself to be a great warrior, and he has a lot of faith in Yahweh. I don't know. It's shocking to me that Jonathan doesn't even appear in this story. Maybe he's gone. Maybe he's doing something else. Maybe he's fighting a different battle. But his absence to me is striking, and it's also striking that, again, we're very quick. We love to pick on Saul and nitpick every little detail. There's plenty to criticize. Don't get me wrong. Saul does a lot wrong. But I think sometimes we're a little unfair, like here, like when we call out Saul, why aren't you challenging Goliath? Because he's probably an old man. He doesn't want to fight Goliath. I doubt, I'm not sure he'd want to fight him when he was young, but I'm saying I think he's got a little bit of a I think he has a bit of a excuse at this point. Yeah, Jonathan, I'm curious about. But moving on. So in verse 12, now David was the son of the Ephrathite from Bethlehem of Judah, named Jesse. Jesse had 8 sons, and during Saul's reign was already an old man. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war, and their names were Eliab the firstborn, Abinadab the next, and Shammah the third, and David was the youngest. The 3 oldest had followed Saul. So obviously we've already had a reference to Jesse and the family earlier when we had the anointing of David. We were already introduced to the 7 older sons. We were not told their order, although it's heavily implied that Eliab's the oldest and Abinadab is the second, mainly because that's the order he introduces them. So it's logical that he's introducing them oldest to youngest. But here it's just confirmed. Now, here we're also told that Jesse's an old man. He's got 8 sons, and David's well into his teens, so that makes sense. Jesse's getting on in years. It's probably not too unlikely that Jesse and Saul are not that different in age, which again would lead credence to Saul being an older man, or getting on in years at least. Here we have a reference that of the 8 sons, 3 have joined the war effort. Right? They're already part of Saul's army, and they're there at the battle. So in verse 10, after Jesse presented 7 of his sons, this is a reference back to 16. After Jesse presented 7 of his sons to him, Samuel told Jesse, the Lord hasn't chosen any of these. So we're already told there were 7. We're already introduced to the first 3 or 4 or so. So this shouldn't surprise us. In verse 15, but David kept going back and forth from Saul to tend his father's flock in Bethlehem. So David has some connection to the army, some connection to the war effort, but he's also, as the youngest, has duties tending the flock, right? Helping out with the father's farm and whatever business the father is doing. Back in 16, we're also told that when Saul was having problems, right, with the evil spirit, that David comes and plays the lyre for him. And here we're already introduced that Saul knows David, knows him intimately, and that David, interestingly enough, is introduced as a warrior. This raises an interesting question, namely that if David is already identified as a warrior, presumably this is earlier than chapter 17, it's going to get to the point where, because later on in the narrative, when David wants to fight Goliath, Saul says, you're too young. So if David's already identified as a warrior in 16, why is Saul objecting to his age now in 17? It's a minor hiccup, but some people like to point that out. Just because he's young doesn't mean he can't fight with the army, but he is probably not of the proper age to be a soldier yet, which is usually agreed upon to be 20. So this would just confirm that he's not 20 yet at the time of the battle. But we'll get to that verse. So in 16, every morning and evening for 40 days, the Philistines came forward and took his stand. One day, Jesse had told his son David, take this half bushel of roasted grain along with these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to the camp. Also take these 10 portions of cheese to the field commander. check on the welfare of your brothers, and bring a confirmation from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines." So this seems to be a fairly regular occurrence. So the battle has been going on for about 40 days, or rather the standoff has been going on. And Bethlehem isn't that far from the valley of Elah, and I'm sure David is itching to go and see what's going on. He wants to know. He's interested in the battle. He's interested in his brothers, and he wants to just see what the outcome is. So Jesse's going to give him an excuse to go, right? Go and take some food for your brothers. They probably would like some decent meals. And you've got something to give to their officers. And you can go and check on them, see how they're doing, see how the battle's going on, and so on. This seems like a very natural thing. Not much has changed in 4,000 years, this kind of thing. The young brother wanting to go off and see the battle and also see how his family is doing. Back in chapter 14, we do get an interesting verse, and I think that this gives us at least some of an excuse. So back in 14, we're told, "The conflict with the Philistines was fierce all of Saul's days, so whenever Saul noticed any strong or brave man, he enlisted him." I take this to imply regardless of their age. So he's so desperate for troops, right? He's so desperate for bodies that any lad who looks strong enough and brave enough to fight, Saul's not going to turn away. Just because someone shows up and says, "I want to fight," he's not going to ask, "Where's your birth certificate? How old are you? How do I know, you're of legal age to fight?" Saul's not asking for that. As long as you're willing to fight, he's willing to put you in the war effort. So in verse 20, "So David got up early in the morning, left the flock with someone to keep it, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had instructed. He arrived at the perimeter of the camp as the army was marching out to its battle formation, shouting their battle cry. Israel and the Philistines lined up in battle formation, facing each other. David left his supplies in the care of the quartermaster and ran to the battle line. When he arrived, he asked his brothers how they were. While he was speaking with them, suddenly the champion named Goliath, the Philistine from Gath, came forward from the Philistine battle line and shouted his usual words, which David heard. When all the Israelite men saw Goliath, they retreated from him terrified." This is pretty straightforward. There's not a whole lot to comment on other than David comes, check on the battle, and he just so happens to be there that he hears this from Goliath. You would think that if David has shown up between now, because again, this has been going on for 40 days, right, this standoff. So if David has checked on his brothers within that 40-day period, that he would already have known. Maybe he had come at different times. Maybe he had I don't know. It seems odd, though, that he would be shocked to find out that this has been going on, unless he just hasn't been there in the 40 days. In verse 25, "Previously, an Israelite man had declared, 'Do you see this man who keeps coming out? He comes to defy Israel. The king will make the man who kills him very rich and give him his daughter. The king will also make the household of that man's father exempt from paying taxes in Israel.' You had me at not paying taxes. That's quite a reward. So not only are you going to be rich, you're going to marry the king's daughter. Saul has at least 2 of them, so he can afford to lose one of them. And you don't pay taxes, which is absolutely fantastic. There's actually precedent for this, for the dangling your daughter as a prize. So this is part of the pre-story of Othniel, the first judge. And this sort of establishes his role as the first judge. So back in Judges 1, verse 8, "The men of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it. They put the city to the sword and set it on fire. Afterward, the men of Judah marched down to fight against the Canaanites who were living in the hill country, the Negev and the Judean foothills. Judah also marched against the Canaanites who were living in Hebron. Hebron was formerly named Kiriath Arba. They struck down Shishai, Ammon, and Talmi. From there, they marched against the residents of Debir. Debir was formerly named Kiriath Sefer. Caleb said, 'Whoever strikes down and captures Kiriath Sefer, I will give my daughter Aksah to him as a wife.'" So Caleb, being one of the 2 righteous men to survive the wilderness, right, Joshua and Caleb, who is probably the leader of Judah, right, and when Joshua dies, that makes Caleb, by default, the last righteous man of the previous generation. He is going to offer up his daughter to the one who can take this city. In my opinion, this is supposed to be a romantic story. That this is supposed to be Caleb, the righteous man, wanting to give his daughter to someone who he sees as worthy of her. And so the only way, or at least in his mind, the way to judge who is worthy is to find someone strong enough and resilient enough to continue the conquest. So I think he's kind of looking for that next Joshua. He's looking for one who can lead the armies, lead the men, and successfully continue the conquest that has been kind of started to die down towards, because we're now in Judges, right? So we're past the time of Joshua, and yet there's still work to be done. And so he wants to find someone who will carry on that work. And it just so happens that Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's youngest brother, captured it. Caleb gave his daughter Aksa to him as a wife. So we got to look over the fact that they're cousins, which is, it's the Bible. Abraham and Sarah were cousins. I'm not judging. But this establishes Othniel as not only of the family of Caleb, right, not only of Judah, but also the one who kind of, I think, is recognized by Caleb to continue the conquest of Joshua. So when people say, again, I've heard so many make the comment that one of Joshua's great failings was that he didn't prepare the next generation of leaders. I don't think that's true. I think that there were leaders for the next generation. I think Othniel was one of them. I think he's recognized by Caleb. The problem is, right, that there is obviously going to be a decline in leadership. Joshua, as great as he was not Moses. And Othniel, as great as he was not Joshua. And so you continue this decline until you get to Samson and Eli and all the failures that they were. So I think that this is supposed to be a sweet romantic story and about the rise of Othniel as kind of the next leader of Israel, and we find out that he's the one who's chosen as the first judge, which is appropriate, right? Because he's the nephew of Caleb and the one recognized to continue the conquest of Judah. So the idea is if Caleb, right, if he was righteous and he was allowed to offer up his daughter as a reward, I'm not condoning that at all. I'm just saying that this happens in the Bible. Then when Saul does it, there's at least some precedence for it. So in verse 26, David spoke to the men who were standing with him. What will be done for the man who kills the Philistines and removes this disgrace from Israel? Just who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? The people told him about the offer, concluding, this is what will be done for the man who kills him. So again, you get a big sack of gold, you get the king's daughter, and you don't have to pay taxes. And all I can think of is no taxes. That's a reward. It's not just David, right? It's his father's household that presumably would be his father and all of his brothers all the way down. So they're all exempt from paying taxes. That's worth risking your life for, I think. So in 28, David's oldest brother Eliab listened as he spoke to the men and became angry with him. Why did you come down here, he asked, and who did you leave those few sheep with in the wilderness? I know your arrogance and your evil heart. You came down to see the battle. This is just such a brother thing to say. There's so many great lines in the Bible that just gives a certain realism to it. So here's the oldest brother yelling at the youngest brother, why are you here? What are you doing? You're just nosing around. You're just slacking off, shirking your chores. You don't want to watch the sheep. Who'd you leave the sheep with anyway? Presumably was one of the other brothers, which maybe they were less reliable. Maybe David's the only one who can watch the sheep because he's the only one who actually do it. But he's like, you're just a typical young boy, right? You just want to come and watch the battle and be entertained. Verse 29, what have I done now, protested David. It's just a question. Then he turned from those beside him to others in front of him and asked about the offer. The people gave him the same answer as before. So I could just see two brothers having this conversation, right? The oldest brother yelling at the younger one, what are you doing? Why are you here? Why are you, what happened to all the chores that you have to be doing back home? And then the younger brother's like, what have I done? I'm just wandering around asking questions. And the older brother's like, yeah, well, we know what you're doing. So just some brotherly back and forth. At least Eliab's not throwing him in a pit and selling him to the Ishmaelites. So he's not the worst brother in the world, or at least in the Bible. Verse 31, what David said was overheard and reported to Saul. So he had David brought to him. David said to Saul, don't let anyone be discouraged by him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. But Saul replied, you can't go fight this Philistine. You're just a youth, and he's been a warrior since he was young. So David's been wandering around the camp. He's asking questions. He's asking why isn't anyone fighting him, probably getting some of the men riled up, probably sticking his nose where he shouldn't be because he's a nosy teenager asking questions. And the older veterans, the older soldiers are kind of annoyed by this. And eventually, Saul, who's fretting in his tent, as he is wont to do, especially in his older age, he's heard about the commotion, and he's found out that there's this kid running around the camp, riling things up. So he's going to settle down this commotion and tell David to knock it off, right? Because he has nothing better to do with his time, apparently. And so David has decided that he wants to fight the Philistine, and Saul has to remind him, you're too young, right? You're not old enough to be a soldier. You're not old enough to be declared a champion. This isn't your responsibility. So verse 34, David answered Saul, your servant has been tending his father's sheep. Whenever a lion or a bear came and carried off a lamb from the flock, I went after it, struck it down, and rescued the lamb from its mouth. If it reared up against me, I would grab it by its fur, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed lions and bears. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. Then David said, the Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistines. Saul said to David, go and may the Lord be with you. So David's going to give one of the more famous answers in the Bible, that as he has tended the sheep and the lambs, he's had the lion, he's had the bear come, and he had to fight them off. He's probably not the only one who's had to deal with this, because in Israel you had lions, especially at this point. We know that Samson, for example, was just randomly attacked by a lion. The Palestinian lions have basically been eradicated, I think, during the Roman time, so we don't really have those anymore. The bears, I assume, were also a problem. But he's driven them off, and he's convinced he can fight off this Philistine as well. It is rather interesting that Saul is so quick to say, go ahead, that he's willing to let him do this. I have a rather pessimistic explanation for why that might be, which we'll get to a little. Maybe cynic is a better word, which we'll get to as we get to the end of the story. But he's going to give David his chance, right? So in verse 38, then Saul had his own military clothes put on David. He put on a bronze helmet on David's head and had him put on armor. David strapped his sword on over the military clothes and tried to walk, but he was not used to them. I can't walk in these, David said to Saul. I'm not used to them, so David took them off. This is a really important couple of verses, 38 and 39. Honestly, in my opinion, these might be the two most important verses in the chapter. And most commentaries recognize the importance of them, mainly because of the irony. So David's going to go and fight the champion of the Israelites, who we already know is decked out in heavy, thick bronze, which is what he probably would have worn at that time. Bronze was durable, it was very malleable, reliable. There's kind of just getting into the use of iron. Iron is mainly used for things like rivets and frames and weapons, not as much for armor at this point. So the fact that he's wearing full bronze armor is what we should expect. Saul, being the king, has his own set of bronze armor, which we would expect, right? Saul is rich, he's important, he's powerful, he needs a good set of armor. Jonathan, as the crown prince, probably also had a nice set of bronze armor. And so since David is going to go and fight Goliath, Saul's going to let him wear his armor to mark him as the champion and to hopefully help him in the battle, right? So what most commentaries recognize is the irony here, right? That David is going to go and fight as the champion. Not only is he fighting as champion, but he is literally going in Saul's place. He is literally wearing Saul's armor. He's going to carry Saul's sword, as if he is the one leading and championing Israel. That's all true, and again, that's where most commentaries go, and that's the observation that most of them make. But I've yet to see a commentary pick up on one very important line in verse 38. To me, it might be the most important line, honestly, the most important line in this whole chapter. This is, he, Saul, put a bronze helmet on David's head. So we already knew from chapter 16 that David was the armor bearer for Saul. Right? He was the one attending to Saul. At this point, we have the role reversal. So it's not just that David's going in Saul's place, but we now see Saul attending David, Saul putting the armor on David. So it's not like he just told another attendant, another servant, take my armor and give it to David, and you can help him. Saul himself is helping David. Again, we have the role reversal. But the text explicitly says one particular piece of equipment. It doesn't say he put the helmet on, he put the armor on, and the greaves, and the braces. He doesn't go through every piece. It explicitly focuses in on the helmet. The helmet that would mark Saul as king on the battlefield. The helmet that would act as a symbol of his power and status. This is probably a very impressive helmet. It's not quite the crown, but it's certainly something that would have marked him, that the men would have recognized. And Saul took the royal helmet and put it on David's head. This is about as close to a coronation as you're going to get. Saul literally putting the royal helmet on David's head to be his surrogate in the battle. This seems like a coronation. And I think that that's the reason why this line is spelt out the way that it is. And it's shocking me that I can't find a single commentary that's picked up on this, that the helmet seems to be emphasized. Again, the whole armor, it mentions the helmet and the rest of the armor, but the fact that the helmet is specified and he himself puts it on David's head, all I can think of is coronation. This is coronation language. Even though Saul himself isn't recognizing it that way, the text is playing it out that way, and it wants us to associate that, right? So in verse 40, instead, right, David, he's not going to wear that. He's not used to it. He's not comfortable in it. And, of course, within the theological confines, we're going to say that he's not going to fight the battle the way that everyone else is, right? He's going to do his own thing. He's going to rely on other means of warfare as opposed to fighting Goliath on his terms, wearing Saul's armor, using Saul's weapons. He's going to do what he's used to. So instead of accepting Saul's equipment, he took a staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in the pouch in his shepherd's bag. Then with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistines. So he goes to the wadi, which we know is a seasonal river. At this point, it might be dry. We're in the dry season because we can go and fight, right? There's no rain or marsh or mud to worry about, so the ground's all nice and hard. But, as I'm sure you've heard in a sermon or whatever, that because we're dealing with river stones, right, the water will smooth down the stones. So you can go to a wadi, to a dry riverbed, and find nice, smooth stones. Now, you might be thinking of, I don't know, a pebble or something that fits in your hand. We have plenty of Stone Age bullets, sling stones. They are about the size of a baseball. They are big, and they are hard, and they are heavy. That's probably what he was using. So something roughly the size of a baseball that's literally as hard as a rock. Maybe a little smaller than a baseball, but again, for reference, not that much smaller. So he's going to, well, you can imagine what's going to happen. We have found these bullets, these sling bullets, with literal words written on them. This is probably the funniest one I found. It's a Greek sling stone, and carved into it is the word catch, which I think is just hilarious. We found stones with names on them. Like you're literally writing someone's name on the stone. It's not clear if it's the person who's throwing it or if it's the person it's intended to hit. I'm not sure. One of the more funny ones is from an intertestamental text that they were writing the word, the Greek equivalent of S-O-N-N-Y, sunny, on bullets. And we have no idea why. What's the significance of writing sunny on a bullet? I don't know. I have no idea. Verse 41, the Philistine came closer and closer to David with the shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he despised him because he was young, healthy, and handsome. Those are odd things to include. We already know that David's good looking, right? He's kind of ruddy and youthful and so on. It's probably a reference to that he's clearly not old enough to be a soldier. Maybe he doesn't have a beard or something else that would mark him as a man. And so he doesn't regard David as a legitimate challenge to him as champion. That will make sense. Verse 43, he said to David, "Am I a dog that you come against me with sticks?" Then he cursed David by his gods. "Come here," the Philistine called to David. "I'll give you the flesh to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts." The idea of cursing Israel is attested to in a couple of places, particularly in the Torah. And of course, you have the irony here. So going back to the Abrahamic blessing, one of the famous lines is from 12:3. "I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who treat you with contempt, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." This is repeated in various ways throughout the Torah, but the idea that those who curse you will ultimately be cursed. So here we have Goliath, who has issued not only challenges against Israel, right, the Israelite armies, has cursed their God, and is now cursing David. So all of those are bad things, right? Not good. So in verse 45, David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with a dagger, spear, and sword, but I come against you in the name of Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel's armies. You have defied him. Today the Lord will hand you over to me. Today I'll strike you down, cut your head off, and give the corpse of the Philistine camp to the birds of the sky and the creatures of the earth. Then all the world will know that Israel has a God. And this whole assembly will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's. He will hand you over to us." So we've got, So David is returning the trash talk. So Goliath has made his threats and curses, and now David is responding in kind with his own threats and curses. And that is what he's doing, right? He's making a threat, he's letting him know what's going to happen, and he is also cursing him. The very language of "I'm going to leave your flesh out against the birds," that's a curse, right? You're not going to be allowed to be cremated or buried. You're just going to be left out to be defiled and ravaged by the beasts. And there are plenty of verses that indicate that as a curse. We'll get to the rest of that, but probably the most famous confrontation to compare this to, because, again, this is almost certainly the most famous account of champion warfare in the ancient world. The account that's probably a close second to that would be the fight between Hector and Achilles. And there we have almost the exact same. We have trash talk right before the fight. So this is from the 22nd book. This is probably the most famous line. "There are no binding oaths between men and lions. Wolves and lambs can enjoy no meeting of the minds. They are all bent on hating each other to the death. So with you and me, no love between us, no truce, till one or the other falls and gluts with blood, Ares who hacks at men behind his rawhide shield." This is the famous response by Achilles. So after Hector finally agrees to fight Achilles, Hector comes out and he says, "I'll fight you, but on a condition." He says, regardless of who loses, we agree that the body is returned to the loser's family so that they can be buried. That's his only condition. And this is his response, that there are no oaths, right? There are no pacts between lions and men. He says, no, I'm not going to do that. And the idea is he doesn't want Hector to be given a proper burial. He wants to leave his body out for the birds and the beasts, just like Goliath and David had their exchange, right? The loser's going to be left out and be defied by the elements. Now, what happens because it's interesting, because we have a similar confrontation or similar situation between both Goliath and David and Hector and Achilles, namely that both are recognized as it's not simply a fight between humans. This is a confrontation of gods. The individual not only represents their respective country, but they also respect their respective deities, their pantheons. So Goliath is fighting as a champion of the gods, not just a champion of the Philistines. David has acknowledged repeatedly that he is fighting as a champion of Yahweh, not just the Israelites. We have the exact same thing with Hector and Achilles. They are representing their gods. And this is why, as they're fighting, right in the Iliad, there's a debate going on during the duel between the gods over who should win. Should it be proud Achilles, or should it be the noble Hector? And in the end, Zeus has to take both of them. He puts them on his scales, and it tips in favor of Achilles. And then Zeus says Achilles is going to win. And then Achilles wins, he kills Hector, and then he refuses to turn the body over, which results in a problem with the gods, because they said that a condition of the fight was that the loser would get, the loser's family would get the body. And that results in a whole deal. But there's just some interesting parallels between the David and Goliath battle and the Hector and Achilles battle. We often frame the David and Goliath story as an underdog story. And this is probably the one kind of point that I'm going to correct. David and Goliath is not an underdog story. It's not. David and Goliath is not a David and Goliath story. You've got we love this sort of myth that we've created. The weaker overcomes the strong. And we even say that there are many accounts in the Bible of this type of story. Probably a better account would be with Gideon. So Gideon is going to fight the enemy army, but he's told to keep reducing the number of men until he's down to 300, and he's going to fight with the 300. But even Gideon is not really an underdog story, right? Because the point of the story isn't that Gideon is going to defeat the greater force with a smaller amount of men. The point is that Gideon has help beyond the 300, right? That there's something else at work besides what we see in the physical plane. And it's even made, I think, particularly clear in the Gideon story that the reason why he's told to reduce his number to 300 is so that when he wins, everyone will know that it wasn't because of the number of men he had, that he was not ultimately to get the glory for the battle. And David has kind of made that clear in his buildup, that if he wins, right, just this little runt with a stick and a sling, people will know that he himself didn't win. It's not his victory. So even framing it as this sort of underdog story kind of goes against David's own words in this account. This is probably the best picture I can find, right? So we frame it as this idea that Goliath, the big bad giant, is taking on the little runt. But the point is that there's someone helping David who's bigger and stronger than Goliath. Now, ideally, if I could really get the picture the way I want it, is there would be another deity behind Goliath, but the deity behind Goliath is smaller and weaker than the deity that's helping David, right? Because that's the point. That yes, you have David and Goliath fighting as champions representing the physical world, but in the heavens, there's a cosmic confrontation, right? Yahweh is fighting the God's champion. And when David wins, it's an indication that in the heavens, his God has defeated the Philistine God. Now, obviously, we're going to say there's no real Philistine God. Fair enough, whether it's Dagon or whatever. But I'm saying within the narrative of the story, that's the picture that's being depicted. That they're fighting just as the gods are fighting in the heavens, which is brought out really well in the Iliad, that both sides, Hector and Achilles, both have their gods defending them, and as they're dueling, although they're not actually fighting in the heavens, which is funny, they're just debating, they're having like this political, just sort of round table discussion on who should get the glory for, who should win and who should get the glory. So it's just a conference, basically, which is not quite as exciting as the duel. But in verse 48, when the Philistine started forward to attack him, David ran quickly to the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in the bag, took out a stone, slung it, and hit the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. Well, that's anticlimactic. After all this buildup, after all this promise, to me, this has the tremendous ring of a very, very famous scene in a movie. So in Raiders of the Lost Ark, very famous movie, there's a great scene, probably the most famous, probably the best scene in the movie, is after a long, excruciating bout, Harrison Ford's fighting off various enemies, he is confronted with this one figure with a sword who pops up, and he has this sword, he's dancing around like a ninja, he's flailing the sword around, and he just pulls his gun and shoots him. It's probably the best scene in the movie. There's a whole legend behind the story about how they had choreographed this long, complicated fight, and George Lucas was very excited about it, and Harrison Ford had been sick. I've heard different accounts that he had a fever, that he had food poisoning or whatever, but he was sick, and he didn't feel like shooting that day, and George Lucas got on him because they were already behind schedule, and he basically said, you either get out here or you're fired, or something to that effect. So Ford, who was sick and couldn't do the choreograph, just walked out and kind of ad-libbed the gun scene. And Spielberg thought it was so funny he kept it in, which made George Lucas upset. But it's a great moment. And this is kind of what happens with David and Goliath, right? Goliath has all this armor, he has these weapons, he's prepared to fight this long, drawn-out battle, and of course he would probably win if it was just a contest of physical strength. And here's David with a sling stone, and he just hits him in the head with a rock. That is easy as can be. So verse 50. So David defeated the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Even though David had no sword, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He grabbed the Philistine's sword, pulled it from its sheath, and used it to kill him. Then he cut off his head. This might be one of the most famous Bible trivia questions of all time, and people always get it wrong. How did David kill Goliath? With a sword. He didn't kill him with a rock. He knocked him out with a rock. And then he ran over, grabbed Goliath's sword, and then cut his head off. It's just it's a Bible trivia question that everyone gets wrong. It says he killed him with the sword. It's as clear as can be. So so there's Goliath, right? He's got the the bullet right in between his eyes. Bronze helmets, there probably wasn't much of a visor, so there was probably room to hit him, about where the forehead is. So again, this is fairly accurate to probably what could have happened in the ancient warfare. And people with slings were very deadly, right? We don't want to undermine just how powerful both, there were entire companies of sling throwers, of stone throwers. You had battalions of archers. There's a famous text, I forget if it's Egyptian or Hittite, but this local king was fighting, and he asked for reinforcements. And he apparently got the reinforcements, but they weren't what he wanted. So he sent a second letter to the emperor, whoever it was, and he said, I asked for reinforcements, and you sent me so many troops. He goes, that's not what I need. I need 300 archers. You send me 300 archers, and I'll win. Now, did he get the archers? We don't know. But he just said, I need 300 archers. Send 300 archers, and we'll be fine. So he would rather have the archers than the foot soldiers, because archers are very skilled and very dangerous. So verse 51. He grabbed the Philistine's sword, pulled it from its sheath, and used it to kill him. Then he cut off his head. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they ran. So this is a fun little tidbit, right? Because this comes back to the whole nature of champion warfare. And one of the complaints that keep coming up among historical critics is, first of all, they argue that there's really no good historical reference to champion warfare. Yes, you have references like David and Goliath in the Bible. You have Hector and Achilles from the Iliad, but the Iliad is very poetic. You've got a few references here and there in various accounts, but how do we know that these are really historic? And one of the arguments that they like to use is, well, even if your champion loses, why would your side give up? And it just makes me wonder if they actually read the Bible. The answer is probably no. So Goliath is dead. And what do the Philistines do? Do they just surrender? Do they just wash their hands and say, well, our champion lost? They run. They flee. They don't give up. They don't surrender. They don't accept the terms of loss. They just, well, our champion died, and they don't stick around to find out what happens after. Even in the Iliad, after Hector dies, they don't give up. The war still goes on. So the idea that both sides would agree to these terms and that they would just honorably, well, our champion lost, so I guess we'll just surrender and whatever, become slaves or have our heads cut off or whatever. That isn't realistic. I mean, this seems pretty realistic to me. They don't give up. They renege on their own conditions. And similarly, just if David had lost, would Saul have honored that? Would he have said, well, this random shepherd boy who wanted to fight and kind of went out on his own, not even wearing a uniform, he lost, so I guess we got to surrender. I don't know. I don't know if Saul would have accepted that as the conditions for loss, but who knows? David wins. And 52, the men of Israel and Judah rallied, shouting their battle cry, and chased the Philistines to the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron. Philistine bodies were strewn all along the Sharaim road to Gath and Ekron. So the Philistines break camp and they run. Obviously, they lost their champion, they're demoralized, and sometimes it's all you need, right? We see this repeatedly. We saw this earlier in chapter, I want to say, 10, after Samuel does the sacrifice and God strikes fear into the Philistines and they kind of run in terror, and then the Israelites just kind of run after them and mow them down. So even though the Philistines did not accept the terms of surrender, the fact that they're so demoralized that they don't want to fight anymore is victory for the Israelites, right? The Philistines have left, they fled, and now they're just going to chase them and kill as many as they can, chasing them all the way back to their own territory. Verse 53, when the Israelites returned from the pursuit of the Philistines, they plundered their camps. David took Goliath's head and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put Goliath's weapons in his own tent. So this is interesting. So the Philistines, they didn't even really break camp, they just fled. They left behind some of their goods, some of their weapons and whatnot, which the Israelites plundered, which I'm sure was very useful. But we get a fun little reference that David takes Goliath's head as a trophy, and he presents it to Jerusalem. This is interesting because Jerusalem is not an Israelite city. It's a Jebusite city. They haven't taken Jerusalem yet. Now, Jerusalem is probably the biggest, largest city near Bethlehem. This has raised the question, of course, we can go with the critical response, which is that this story is from a later tradition, and we just have an inconsistency, right? That Jerusalem we associate as the city of David, so that's where he would take it, but whoever wrote this forgot that Jerusalem has been taken yet. I don't go that way. I don't take this as an inconsistency. It is interesting that he doesn't present it as a trophy to Saul, which is what we would expect. But he's not going to let Saul have the credit for this. He's not going to give it to Saul, not going to let Saul take credit, not going to let Saul get the glory. So the question becomes, why take it to Jerusalem? And the best answer I've come across is because Jerusalem at this point is technically a neutral city. They're not really an enemy of Israel, but they're not really friendly with Israel. So David has taken it to Jerusalem basically as a statement of Israelite power, showing them, look what we did to the Philistines, look what we did to their champion, and knowing that by giving it to Jerusalem, word's going to spread. And if it comes from, if he sends it to one of the Israelite cities and word spreads there, then people are going to say it's just Israelite propaganda. Well, how do we know it's true? How do we know that they really did this? This is just them spreading their own tales. But by giving it to Jerusalem and letting the Jebusites see it and letting them talk about it, well, the Jebusites aren't friends of Israel, so why would they make that up? Why would they lie about it? So if they've got the head as proof of what David and the Israelites did, then the surrounding peoples and territories are going to be more likely to believe it from a Jebusite than an Israelite. So this is to promote the strength of Israel and the strength of Yahweh. And we'll end there for tonight. I think that's a good place.
Do y'all know what David proved by decapitating Goliath? He knew how to get ahead. It was pretty bad, I know. Pretty bad joke. Thank you, James. All right, let's close in prayer. John, would you close us, brother?